Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Ministry of Agriculture's Invasive Species webinar series. This is the second webinar we'll be doing, and today we're focusing on absinthe. My name is Margaret Parsons, and I'm an agri-environmental specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture based out of Humboldt, and I'll be chairing this webinar today. The speakers from the ministry today are Kiana Bohr, an agri-environmental specialist, and Luke Jorgensen, a range management extension specialist. First, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The Ministry of Agriculture respects and has the honor of working on lands within Saskatchewan. I wish to acknowledge Saskatchewan is the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Blackfoot, Cree, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Sioux, and home of the Métis people. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to moving forward in partnership with these Indigenous nations. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. So this presentation is scheduled to take about 40 minutes, leaving time for questions or comments at the end. If you have questions during the presentation, you can type them in the question box in the bottom right-hand corner of the control panel there, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end of the presentation. Because during the presentation you'll be muted, so there's no feedback that interferes with the audio. There's also a telephone option if you're having difficulty hearing or accessing the presentation. That requires you to dial in to listen through your phone. After you exit the webinar today, a brief evaluation will appear, so please take the time to fill it out since it helps us plan events in the future. And then a link to the recorded webinar will be sent out to any registered participants who missed it or want to watch it again, and we'll also be posting it to our website following the live presentation. We also have CEUs being offered for CCAs on the webinar today, but in order to get the credit, you have to attend the entire live event, and we'll have a QR code at the end of the presentation to collect the credit. So if you missed the code and you attended live, please email us afterwards and we can help you get that credit. So at this time, we'll start the webinar and I'll hand it off to Kiana.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. Like Margaret said, my name is Kiana and I am going to talk about absinthe today. So absinthe, also known as commonly wormwood or common wormwood, but the scientific name is Artemisia absinthium. So it's native to Europe and Asia, and it was introduced to North America, but it's now quite widespread across the Canadian prairies. And it does have a history of medicinal use, so that's likely why it was introduced to North America, as it contains the chemical thujone, which does impact the central nervous system. I won't go into that too much on the webinar today, but that's likely why it was introduced to North America in the first place. So it's a perennial forb or a broadleaf plant. So that top growth dies back every year while the underground plant parts stay active over winter, and then it grows back in the spring, like most perennial plants do. And it does belong to the aster or the Asteraceae family. So this is the family with those unique flower structures, and they often produce many seeds. So other plants in that family are also quite weedy in nature. So like dandelion and thistles are also in the aster family. So absinthe is usually a problem on our perennial vegetation system, so haylands, native rangeland, tame forage used for grazing, also road allowances or ditches, anywhere there's that perennial forage vegetation. It's typically not a problem on those annual cropping systems just because of that constant or repetitive tillage passes and herbicide use. Doesn't get a chance to get established in those systems. But it can spread throughout those perennial vegetation areas and really reduce the biodiversity, and it can impact just the overall production of the land and the quality of the forage as well. So it can be pretty hard to eradicate once it gets established in those perennial systems. Now, absinthe is pretty widespread across the Canadian prairies and throughout Saskatchewan, but it does prefer abundant moisture. So if we're getting a lot of dry conditions, maybe we'll see it more on like those north-facing slopes or shaded areas where it can get a bit more moisture. And as far as grazing, generally livestock tend to avoid it, especially cattle. It has a bit of a bitter taste to them. and it can taint their milk a bit and give it, even the milk, a bit of a bitter taste. So generally, they avoid grazing it. And in Saskatchewan, it is under the Weed Control Act, absinthe is designated as Schedule 2 or noxious. So that means it's established in Saskatchewan beyond basically practical control for practical eradication, but it's still spreading. So the goal is just to prevent and slow down that spread. So as land managers, effort does need to be made to kind of control the spread of absinthe. And so, like I said, absinthe is a perennial, and it does have a deep taproot. And as far as identification, it just has these gray kind of, or green, kind of grayish green leaves, and it does have these silky kind of hairs on them that give it that silvery look. And the leaves they're alternately arranged on the stem. So when it grows older, they'll be alternately arranged on the stem. But when their plants are young, they do have the kind of this basal growth. And they have this like kind of these silky hairs that give it this gray kind of like sage coloring to it. I'll just go to this next photo. So as the plants grow and mature, they do get a bit taller and stockier, and they branch out a bit more from that basal base. And those older plants can get kind of a woody base as well. So as it overwinters, they can get kind of a woody base, like a shrub, but it is a form, not a shrub. And the flowers are quite small and inconspicuous. They are yellow, and they'll be at the leaf axis on like the tips of the branches, where the leaves meet the branch kind of in that axis. And the most key distinguishing feature for absinthe is just has a strong sage-like odor. So like our native sages, it does kind of smell like sage. So similar species that you might get confused with absinthe are native Artemisia or sage species. So on the left there is pasture sage. It's a much smaller plant than absinthe is, and it does have much finer leaves. It's almost fern or moss-like. So a lot smaller than absinthe and much finer leaves. In the middle, we have prairie sage. It's also smaller than absinthe, and the leaves are quite different. They're not divided and lobed like the absinthe leaves are. They have these entire leaf edges, so much different leaves. And then our sagebrush is, of course, a shrub species, and the leaves are similar to pasture sage when they're not deeply lobed and divided, but they do have these entire leaves. So leaves are quite different on prairie sage and sagebrush, but all three of these species do have that kind of silver gray green coloring, and they also smell like sage. So that can be kind of tricky to tell them apart for those reasons. And just to consider how absinthe reproduces is important when we think of our control methods. So absinthe does reproduce by seed, and those seeds are typically viable in the soil for 3 to 5 years, which is somewhat short compared to other species that can be like at least 10 years viable in the soil. And those seeds, they do easily spread just like seed fall from the mature mother plant, moves with soil or in snow or water. If those plants tumble across, they can spread seeds that way, and just getting caught in equipment or in gravel or soil that's moving from site to site. And so flowering generally occurs from July to September. So within that period, flowers will be produced and seeds will set. So seeds that fall into the soil early enough in the season will kind of grow into that rosette form that they can overwinter as. And if it's later in the season when those seeds fall, then they'll just overwinter as a seed in the soil. So that does kind of make management difficult because you're trying to control basically 3 different stages of plants: those mature established plants that are overwintering each year, those basal rosettes that are overwintering in the fall, and then just those seeds that are sitting in the soil. So one win, though, is that absinthe does not have a rhizome. So that's good that it can only reproduce by seed rather than vegetatively as well. If you were to pull an absinthe plant up and left some of the root in the soil, it could regrow from that, but generally doesn't have those like creeping roots that a lot of other weed species have. So if you attended our previous webinars, we did touch on integrated weed management a little bit in that, but I'll just review it for anyone who's new today. So basically, integrated weed management is just a weed management system, and we use it as a method to control weed species. And really the goal is to use several different control practices rather than just using one after time. So for example, instead of spraying the same herbicide on the same weed year after year, maybe you'll integrate some grazing or a mowing pass in addition to your herbicide pass. And it just helps to keep those weeds kind of off balance and they don't know what's coming next. And if we kind of switch up those practices, we can also help prevent herbicide resistance in the process. So the first step is prevention. So if we can prevent weeds from even becoming established on our site, then it's much easier to control them in the long run. So to prevent weeds from getting established, we can start with a clean seed source. So if you were to seed forages on a site, just making sure that that seed source is weed-free or has a limited number of weeds, and you can get a seed certificate to see that information on it. For imported feed sources, if you're bringing feed, so say hay or something from another site, if there was a weed problem at the site that you're bringing that hay from, maybe you want to avoid bringing that to a sensitive site or putting it in a site that can, kind of like a closed site where you can control the spread of any weed seeds from that site. And then maintaining healthy forage stands is important. Those healthy forage stands are more resilient to outcompete any weed species that might establish. And then similarly, avoiding any soil disturbance. So there's less bare ground for weeds to germinate on. And if a weed problem is known, clean equipment is really important. Biosecurity practices. So if you have a weed problem and you know about it, just making sure that any equipment going in and out of there is clean, and you're being diligent to clean those between sites so that you're avoiding spreading seeds from one site to another. And then integrated weed management, also all the different control options come with it. So just to review those, they're pretty general. I'm sure most of you are aware of them, but we have our physical and mechanical, our cultural, chemical, and then biological. So physical control methods could be tillage, a mowing pass, physically hand pulling those weeds out, targeted grazing, or even a prescribed fire. And cultural control is kind of adjusting the environment to make it harder for the weed to survive. So maybe you're adjusting your seeding timing or row spacing, and then managing for those healthy forage systems. Chemical control, of course, those are our herbicide applications, and biological are those living organisms that are targeting our weed species, so using insects or bacteria or fungi. And really the goal of all these control methods is to use a combination of them, again, to keep those weeds off center. And then the last part of integrated weed management is our monitoring and record keeping. So record keeping is just essential to know if you're even making progress on your weed control efforts. So you can make this as simple or as complicated as you want. So just simply scouting fields every year to see if you have new weed problems or if your management actions are working. Rangeland health assessments are a tool that can be used on our rangeland ecosystems to see if we're making progress. Recording location, so just taking photos of an area. If you can georeference those photos and go back to that spot the next year, you can see what it looks like. GPS locations, or even just a permanent marker that you can see if the patch size is getting smaller or larger. And then, yeah, keeping notes of any of your management actions just to know if they're working or not, basically, and so that you can go back and reference what you've done in the past. So getting back to Absinthe, I'm going to go through a few of the non-herbicide options for control, and then I'll pass it over to Luke, who's going to talk about our herbicide options to control Absinthe. So for cultural control, the best we can do is just manage for healthy forage stands. So if you're establishing a new stand, making sure that you're starting with a clean field. So spraying weeds before you start seeding and trying to establish a new stand. If you have an existing stand, managing for not overgrazing, so managing your grazing systems, minimizing soil disturbance, kind of that stuff I talked about before, and then practicing good biosecurity. So having clean equipment, clean seed sources, things like that. So then for physical and mechanical control, hand pulling can be an option if you have really small isolated patches or maybe just a couple of plants. It's hard to get that whole large taproot out of the ground, and if you don't get it all, it can regrow from some of those root fragments. But it is hard on the plant. It does really draw down those energy reserves if you keep pulling it out. So just be careful not to disturb the soil too much. But for small patches, this could be an option. Mowing is another option, and really the goal is just to reduce seed production and seed spread. So mowing before flowering and seed set to keep that plant in a vegetative state. Yeah, repeated mowing can also help weaken the plant by drawing those energy reserves. If it keeps growing, has to keep growing back. So that's helpful. You're not going to kill the plant by mowing it, but you can help reduce that seed spread. And Absinthe can kind of play a little trick and respond to repeated mowing passes by kind of growing horizontal stems. So just another reason to include integrated weed management. So keep different control methods coming at it so that it can't grow horizontally all the time on you. And as far as grazing, like I said before, generally livestock will avoid grazing absinthe if there's other more palatable forage available to them, just because of that bitter taste and that tainting of the milk, especially for cattle. Sheep and goats could be an option. They also generally don't seek it out, but they might consume it if it's available to them or if there's a lot of it there. There's kind of a lack of scientific research or data on how effective grazing absinthe is to control it. So we don't really know the timing of grazing needed or how intensely you need to graze for absinthe to be controlled. But it could be a future option. And I know there's a few cities in Alberta, they've been experimenting with grazing goats and sheep on their absinthe plants. So I haven't seen any of those monitoring results yet, but it would be interesting to see if they've had any reductions in absinthe so far. And for biological control, there's also not a lot of options out there, pretty limited scientific research on biological controls. There was one biocontrol, an insect, a snout moth, and the larvae feeds on the absinthe stems and roots. So it was actually screened to be a biocontrol in Canada, but because of such a similarity in species between our absinthe and our native Artemisia plants, there's just a risk to those native plants that they would also be impacted. So it was it's not used in Canada as a biocontrol agent, and it probably never will be, just because of the risk to those native species. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Luke, and he's going to talk about our herbicide options. There you go, Luke.
Not showing yet. There we go. Do we have it by screen up?
You're good.
Okay. Yeah, right on. Thanks, Kiana. And my name's Luke Jorgensen, and I am going to take the opportunity to talk about chemical control. And yeah, I'll get right into it. So chemical control, like Kiana mentioned, it's a component of an integrated approach. But outside of hand pulling, it's really the only way to eliminate an absinthe infestation once it's there from a perennial cropping like a hay or pasture environment. I will focus on controlling it in perennial systems because that's, like Kiana mentioned, where we see the most issues with it. And yeah, I'll talk about some of the recommended products, some of the things to consider when selecting a herbicide, and some results from some research that the Ministry of Ag and our partners have done in the last 10 years or so. And I'll start by referring to the 2024 Guide to Crop Protection. So this is a really good resource for when you're trying to determine how to use chemicals to control any types of weed, really, but specifically for absinthe. I'll get into my sort of recommendation process. So the Guide to Crop Protection is available online, or you can pick it up at a regional office. But on page 85, this is a really good resource for absinthe and for any sorts of weeds that you're seeing in grass pastures or hay fields. And it's just a chart to show you what options are available, what chemical options are on label for controlling each of the the different weeds that you'll see in these systems. So I highlighted everything to make it nice and clear or confusing, I guess. But absinthe, I highlighted, it's on the top, so the different weeds are on the top. I highlighted in blue, and where it intersects with the different products, it tells you what kind of control, if there's control, and what kind of control or suppression you should expect. So the products I highlighted in yellow, so 2,4-D or dicamba plus 2,4-D, these provide only top growth suppression, so they won't get into the roots and really kill the plant, but they will suppress growth for that year. And then the products in green will actually control the plant and kill the plant in the taproot and provide some residual control. Absinthe and a few other weeds, but it does have its own, on page 88 in the Guide to Crop Protection, it does have its own specific recommendations because it is a unique weed that you see mostly in pasture and hay systems. And the products recommended here are, and I'll get into all of these, but 2,4-D ester, dicamba, Reclaim 2 or Clearview or Sightline, Restore 2 or Milestone, and then I'll talk about Casseron a little bit. It's not for the hay or pasture systems. So only use label approved herbicides from the 2024 Guide to Crop Protection. That's a key recommendation here when you're selecting your product. And the kind of effect you'll see depends obviously on what chemical you use, where you're using it, right? The density of the infestation, if you're doing spot spraying or if you've got a really bad infestation, you're spraying the whole thing. And timing. Timing is really important. If you've got a smaller plant, it needs less chemical for more effect, right? As these absinthe plants get really large and lots of above ground biomass, you need a lot more chemical really to get that control. And like I mentioned, some will suppress the growth and some will actually kill the plant and or permanently or long-term control the infestation. So yeah, getting into these, 2,4-D ester is one of the chemicals that provides the suppression of growth. It's a group 4, so in synthetic auxin, it confuses the plant's hormonal signaling and causes all sorts of messed up growth. It's absorbed by the leaves, and it does move within the plant to an extent. Its application, this is on the label, but 1.82 liters per acre in late June typically is a good time to spray, and it might need retreatment. So it does control the top growth, and if you spray it before it sets seed, it will work to reduce the seed bank because it's, the plant isn't able to grow and to produce seed in that year. But you will have to spray it year over year to control it because it doesn't kill the roots. Same can be said for dicamba. It's also like Banville, right? It's a group 4 herbicide, similar to 2,4-D. It does have a bit more systemic movement and a little bit more effective, but there's still often regrowth seen in the year of application. And I guess we can move on to the more potent ones or the more effective ones. So the Reclaim 2, Clearview or Sightline. These are similar products, but in addition to the group 4 herbicides that we've talked about, the auxin, sorry, it also has an ALS inhibitor. So these contain clopyrrolid or aminopyrrolid or metsulfurones. In addition to the synthetic auxins, sorry, it also has an ALS inhibitor, which disrupts the plant cell division process. So these ones do provide much better control. Clearview works really well, and it does provide season-long control and residual control, right? So these can actually control the infestation and eliminate the plants that are growing. They are more expensive, typically. The Clearview, it's a wettable granule, so it needs to be agitated when you're spraying. It needs agitation to remain in suspension. and these can be applied or are typically applied with 2,4-D for the effective control in both of the modes of action. Restore 2 or milestone, similar, right? So they're group 4s as well with the aminopyrrolids and the 2,4-D. These provide residual control too. These can be really effective. All of these herbicides that I'm mentioning will eliminate like legumes in a pasture or hay stand. So that's something we need to think about, and something I'll talk about a bit more. But the Restore 2 and Milestone, they also have, they will kill the roots, and there is some residual control. Castoron, I'll mention briefly. It's not something I've worked with or seen used, but it's a pre-emergence herbicide. It's group 20. So it's no good in hay or pasture in these systems that we're talking about. But if you're trying to establish shelter belts, this is a granular product that's broadcast, and it'll stop the absinthe from germinating, right? So it's used primarily for shelter belt establishment. So there are a couple so agricultural demonstration practices and technologies projects that I'd like to mention, and some of the results are interesting. So like I mentioned, the control options for absinthe will eliminate broadleaf plants in your stand, the desirable broadleaf species. So this project in 2016 looked at trying to get rid of the absinthe while preserving the legumes in the stand using wiping systems. So a roto wiper is displayed there on the left, and the PVC pipe with the wettable wick, right? Those are the two options that this project used. And glyphosate is the only product labeled for wiping application. So it was the product used in this trial. The results here, like I mentioned, glyphosate was what was used. It was applied in early July, so kind of after the absinthe had shot up, had bolted, and after the pasture had been grazed to increase the height difference between the alfalfa, the desirable broadleaf species, and the absinthe that they were trying to control. The rope wick applicator provided some control, but the rotor wiper, which is a commercially available product, it provided 80% control of the absinthe in the stand. When you're using these products, it's glyphosate and a really concentrated product, right? 30%-ish, and yeah, that's on the label, and it worked really well, especially the rotor wiper to preserve the legumes in the stand and have an effect on the absinthe. These methods are less effective in absinthe control than just broadcast, right? Because you're not getting all of it, maybe, but it's an option if you want to keep your legumes. The second adopt project, this one was done in 2013, looked at 6 different herbicides and just evaluated their effectiveness. So you can see sort of the summary there: 2,4-D, Danville, Restore, Reclaim, and Graze On. If it's got a check mark, it did provide good season-long control. If it's got that little X, it maybe suppressed the stand, like I mentioned, suppressed the growth of the absinthe, but didn't control it, didn't kill the plants. So just from this project was done on 6 sites, but 4 of the sites here, you can see the on the bottom, it's the time since application, and you can see the different colors of the lines here will show you how much absinthe was in the stand over time. And kind of the pattern I want you to see here is the control, the 2,4-D, the Danville, there was still absinthe present 12 months after application, like the next year. But the Restore, the Reclaim, the Graze On worked really well to control absinthe into the next year, right? And another way of looking at this is each of these charts is for the different herbicides that were applied, and you can see Danville, so dicamba, had an effect, right? But there was still, 12 months later, there was still absinthe in a couple of the sites and substantial in the Crawford location. Whereas the Restore, the Reclaim, the Graze On worked really well, again, to provide that residual control. Things like the organic material in your soil, the biological activity, the texture, affect how quickly these products decompose. So you will see variable results. And this is just, it looks at the cost of the different products that were used in this project. These numbers are 10 years old and certainly out of date, but it does give you an idea of the comparison, per acre. The 2,4-D is certainly the cheapest option, right? But didn't provide effective long-term control. So some of the takeaways, these control options will not preserve the legumes in your stand. If you're spraying to control absinthe, you're going to lose your alfalfa, you're going to lose your desirable broadleaf species. Unless you use a wiping method, which, especially the rotor wiper, which can get the absinthe and leave your legumes if you manage it right. The group 2 and 4 herbicides offer the best control overall into the year after and beyond, whereas the group 2 will just suppress the growth for that year, but they are a lot cheaper. Chemical control is just part of an integrated weed management plan, right? Managing the spread, managing the seeds, biosecurity, all of these things are really important. And always read and follow the manufacturer labeled directions when you're using any of these products. And yeah, that's it for me. I will hand my presenter view back to Kiana.
Thanks, Luke. Okay, so I'll continue on here. We do have a few funding options available if you're looking to control some invasive species. So there is, the most up-to-date information is always available on the website, but feel free to contact the people I'll chat about below, and you can get some more information from them as well. So first is the Pest Biosecurity Program, and the Invasive Plant Control Program is underneath the Pest Biosecurity Program. So the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities deliver this program. So if you're interested in more information on this, you can contact your local RM or your local plant health technical advisor. Under the Resilient Agriculture Landscapes Program, we do have the Targeted Grazing BMP. And this BMP is specifically for controlling large-scale invasive weed infestations that may not be applicable for herbicide applications. So if you're wanting to use small ruminant grazing, so sheep or goats, to control some invasive species, this might be applicable to you. So you can contact your local Ministry of Ag office or your local agri-environmental specialist, and they can give you a hand with that. And there's also the Crown Land Pasture Association Invasive Weed Program. So this provides funding for pasture associations who are dealing with invasive weed problems on their Crown land, their grazing leases. So they can reach out to their local land management specialists for more information and program support on that. And so just to summarize kind of what we talked about today, planning ahead is one of the most important parts of weed control methods. So early detection and rapid response, if you can get on top of these invasive species before they become really established and out of control, that's the best way to stay ahead of them. Scouting your land, so just making sure that you're out there looking for weeds is really important. So if you can get some weed ID skills, that's really helpful to see what you have out there before they're becoming established. And then, like Luke said, integrating herbicides and all of these other practices together. So using site-specific control options is really important. So maybe what works for you might not work for your neighbor, but just seeing if you can get a couple different control options going. And then monitoring your management actions, so seeing if they're actually making a difference or not, and always be prepared to adjust your plan. So if what you're working on, what you're doing is not working, maybe just adjusting and pivoting to something else and trying that to see if you get better results. So be sure to join us for our last webinar of this series, which is on Thursday, February 27th. We're going to cover common tansy. And also just a note that our crops extension specialist team also is putting on some winter webinar series, and you can find those and sign up for them on the Saskatchewan Agriculture Events calendar, which is on our website. So I'm going to pass it back to Margaret, and we can answer any questions.
Great, thanks Kiana and Luke. So just starting to get into some questions here. The first one would be for Kiana. Is there much information about timing and frequency of mowing absinthe as part of its management?
Yeah, there's not a lot of like scientific information out there. For sure, you would want to do it before those plants are flowering and setting their seeds. So if they're flowering from kind of July to September time, you would want to get out there before they're flowering and setting seeds. So I would be scouting out in June and just to keep those plants in their vegetative state. So get out there in June to July and just make sure before that they're flowering, you can get that mowing done.
Great, thanks. And this might be for you or either of you. Has anyone ever tried a weed wick after high density grazing, likely mid-season once it's tall enough to miss the alfalfa and grass? And what herbicide would be best to use in that case? You're muted, Luke. Oh, you're still muted.
Thank you.
There we go.
Yeah, so in that project I discussed, the application, the herbicide that was applied was glyphosate. Glyphosate does control absinthe, although maybe it's not the best choice if you're trying to spray absinthe out of a pasture because it'll control everything else too. But it's the only product that's labeled for wick application. And the effective, well, the results that were seen from the project I discussed were after the application. The wiping was done after some pretty heavy grazing to really target those desirable species, those alfalfa, the broadleaf species in the stand and the grasses to reduce the height of those because cattle will select against absinthe. They'll graze around it, but they'll leave the absinthe. So that wiping application is most effective if done after some heavier grazing.
Great, thanks. Question for Kiana. Are there any specific crops that are most affected by this weed? And have you come across any that naturally deter it by releasing specific phytoemissions?
Sorry, Margaret, can you say that again?
Sure. Are there any specific crops most affected by absinthe? And have you come across any crops that naturally deter it by releasing specific phytoemissions?
Okay, interesting. I have not come across that. And I did not find that any like specific crops were most affected by absinthe. It was just like those general, like your perennial forage stands. So whether that's native species or tame species, like they can just, those absinthe plants can just grow in the ditch with your tame, likely smooth brome, or they can take over in your native native rangeland system. So I didn't find specific plants that are most affected by absinthe, but absinthe is a problem in those perennial forage stands. And yeah, I didn't find any information about like absinthe taking over specific stands. So there is like some people say that absinthe has allelopathic effects, but there's not a lot of like scientific data out there to back up one way or the other. So the jury's still out on that.
Thanks. And another question for you, what's a typical lifespan of an individual absinthe plant?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a specific time. I guess like those general perennial plants can live like five years. But I guess, yeah, I don't know if there's a specific time that absinthe like lives on for sure.
Yeah. For sure. And then question for you, Luke, is there a specific growth stage to consider when applying chemical control to kill absinthe, or is there a method that you suggested was effective across different growth stages? And then is there any residual issue for the crops in the next season?
Yeah, so The best time to apply the herbicide is after the leaves have fully emerged, right? Um, and kind of earlier in the season when there's less, like I said, less of that above ground biomass. Sometimes these plants can get really big and heavy, and that'll require more chemical to control. So, you know, June, right, into early July, depending on your moisture and where you are, right? But after the leaves have fully emerged, for sure. And then, yeah, some of these chemicals, like the Clearview and the Reclaim 2, will have residual effects into the next year, not just on the absinthe that you sprayed, but if you spray absinthe with these chemicals and then next year try to establish alfalfa, you're going to run into problems there.
For sure. And then how does soil type or moisture level impact the success of herbicide applications?
That's a complicated question. It affects certainly how the residual herbicides will break down in the soil, right? If there's more moisture, they can break down a little more quickly, but there's a lot of variables there. Moisture, I mean, if the plants are actively growing, right, if there is moisture, then the herbicides will be more effective. All of them, not just the residual ones.
For sure. And then are there any cases of herbicide resistance in absinthe?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Kiana, you might be able to answer this one. Has there ever been prescribed fire that has been used effectively to help control absinthe?
Yeah, so I did try and find some papers on this there. I couldn't find anything that was done in like Canada or Saskatchewan. I did find some work that was in the United States, and it's quite old work. I think it was from the 80s or 90s. And they did burn absinthe in the spring. It kind of worked. It only worked in the spring though, and there was repeated fire. You had to do it several times to get control. But there hasn't been anything done in Canada or Saskatchewan. So I don't know, if it would work up here as well as it worked down in the States. But yeah, so it's a research opportunity, I guess, in Canada and Saskatchewan to see if absinthe can be controlled by fire.
For sure. And then question for you, Luke. Can any of the products that you mentioned be applied by airplane, drone, or helicopter for a rangeland that couldn't be accessed with a ground sprayer?
Yes, some of these I can't say off the top of my head, but some of these are approved for aerial application. Restore 2, I think, but I can follow up with those recommendations.
For sure. And then another question for you. What are the signs that a herbicide treatment isn't working, and when would you consider reapplication?
Right, so depending on the herbicide that you use, if the plants are still actively growing, you know, if you sprayed in mid-June and you go in late June and you see that they're starting to flower, the application isn't working if the plants are still growing. And again, some of these products only suppress the top growth rather than kill the plant. Considering reapplication, again, if the plant is actively growing, you know, earlier in the year, would be better. If it's still growing and you don't consider your application successful a few weeks after your first try.
Great. Question for you, Kiana. So biennial wormwood and absinthe can appear very similar. Is there a distinctive ID to be able to tell them apart?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the sage smell is really important. So I don't believe biennial wormwood has a sage smell, and absinthe will have kind of that distinct sage smell. If you crush the leaves between your fingers, they'll have that smell. Absinthe is also typically a little more that silver kind of gray-green color, whereas biennial wormwood is quite green. It won't have those kind of silvery gray hairs on them. And yeah, I think the leaves are a bit different between biennial wormwood has a bit more pointed tips on those, like does have like deeply lobed leaves as well, but a little bit pointier than on absinthe buds.
For sure. Are there specific soil types that favor absinthe growth more than others?
I don't know if I know the answer to that, but for sure they like a bit more moisture. So those soils that'll hold moisture more so. So maybe those loam soils are a bit more of a problem than sandy soils, because sandy soils lose that moisture a bit faster than a nice loam soil would. But yeah, I don't know if there is a specific soil texture that they prefer for sure.
Okay. And then this could be Kiana, I think. Are there specific cover crops or grasses recommended for planting after tilling absinthe?
After tilling absinthe. I don't know if there's any specific ones. I would be tempted to be seeding if you had, I don't know in what application this would be, like if it was in an annual crop system and you wanted to like spray out and till out your absinthe and then seed some forage crops. If that's the application, I'm not sure what this person is meaning, but I would be seeding maybe some aggressive species that can have rhizomes and creeping roots that can kind of outcompete any absinthe species that might pop up. So maybe some hybrid brome species or something with a rhizome that could creep and fill in those spaces where absinthe so that it can't establish again.
Sure. And then another question, what would be the best way to control absinthe in a hawthorn tree line?
Luke, are you familiar with that?
I'm not at all. No, I mean, depending on the situation, sometimes hand pulling is the way to go.
For sure. Question for you, Luke. What is the time frame to assess the effects of chemical application before deciding whether to reapply? Which similar to the last question, I guess, about that.
Yeah, I can't answer that too specifically. Most of these products will have a pretty rapid effect that you'll be seeing a lot of effect in the first couple weeks for sure. Insofar as assessing specifically when to reapply, I can't give a really precise recommendation, and it depends on the herbicide.
For sure. All right, great. Well, that's all the questions that we have listed here, but if anyone else has any questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to Kiana or Luke, and we can probably put up the CEU credit now.